Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really digging into the foundations, the sort of intellectual plumbing of neurodiversity research.
Yeah, specifically, we're looking at this really persistent idea called diametric cognition.
Right. It's this, well, elegant concept. Been around a while, hasn't it? It positions autism and psychotic affective conditions as like perfect opposites on a spectrum.
Exactly. But what our sources are showing is that this neat framework, well, it keeps sticking around, often making it harder to grasp the real messy complexity of lived experience.
So we're essentially investigating the infrastructure of maybe flawed ideas, how they get built and stay standing.
That's it. We've got sources showing how things like intellectual pedigree, just sheer repetition, and now even AI amplification. It all keeps this symmetrical idea relevant way past its sell-by date, you could say.
And for you listening, this dive is about more than just the theory itself, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's about understanding why the academic world, and maybe all of us sometimes, can mistake symmetry for truth.
Okay, let's get into it. Our starting point was actually quite surprising. Our source was looking at a very recent paper, 2025, Ganai et al., network analysis on pre-adolescent traits.
Yeah, seemed cutting edge, nuanced, totally. But then, buried in a citation, kind of a tripwire, was this phrase, diametric cognition. And it pointed right back to Crespi and Badcock, 2008.
Okay.
And that citation is like the ghost in the machine, pulls the whole conversation back onto this very clean binary axis.
So that 2008 model, what's its core claim?
The headline is that autism and psychotic affective conditions are, and this is the quote, diametrical disorders of the social brain.
Diametrical disorders.
Yeah.
So what does that axis actually look like? How does it work in their model?
Well, it basically forces minds into these two opposite camps. On the autism side, you've got strong, systemizing, understanding, rule-based systems, and what they termed undermentalizing.
Mind blindness, essentially, right? That idea. And then on the psychosis pole, it's the exact opposite. Over-mentalizing, hyper-empathy, maybe seeing intentions where there aren't any, which can shade into paranoia or affective excess. It feels very neat, balanced, like two sides of a coin.
Precisely. It's an intellectual structure that feels complete, very tidy.
Yeah.
Which leads to the question, why does this framework, nearly 2 decades old now, keep cropping up in new research? Why is it so sticky? Well, the source is pretty direct about this. Academia kind of likes its binaries. It likes clean stories. The coherence it seems to offer is, well, it's seductive, intellectually speaking, especially when the reality is so complex.
I think there's more to it than just tidiness.
Oh, yeah. It's persistent signals pedigree. It's got, as the source says, Cambridge soil under its roots. It feels solid, partly because it seems to come from this recognized intellectual family tree.
Ah, okay. So that lineage is crucial. This isn't some random idea popping up. It's connected, firmly rooted in that Cambridge orbit.
Exactly. The whole intellectual climate shaped by Simon Baron-Cohen's work on systemizing and, the extreme male brain theory.
So the 2008 theory wasn't built in isolation.
Not at all. Once the field sort of accepted that autistic cognition was mainly about extreme systemizing and maybe less social intuition, that extreme male brain, logic almost demanded an opposite, didn't it?
You needed something with too much social intuition.
Right. Or too much emotion, too much mind reading. So when modern papers just cite Crespi Badcock without critique, they're essentially treating that whole older lineage as, like, established fact.
Yeah.
As bedrock, not just a hypothesis anymore.
Okay, but this is where the critique really bites, isn't it? When we look at the language used about people, our sources point to this really problematic rhetorical move, especially in later work by Badcock in 2019.
Yeah, it's like academic extraction. It takes the language people use to describe their own experiences and twists it. Well, think about it. Autistic people might use metaphors to talk about feeling excluded, right? Saying something like, I felt like an alien because the world just didn't seem built for how their mind works. They're naming a social wound, the pain of not fitting in.
Okay, feeling like an alien because of exclusion. Exactly. But then the rhetoric flips it. The academic lists that phrase, I felt like an alien, and reclassifies it. It becomes evidence for the theory, turning the feeling of exclusion into a statement of inherent nature. I am alien. Wow. So it takes a description of a social problem, a world not meeting a mind, and turns it into proof of an innate neurological condition.
Precisely.
Yeah.
That's a really dangerous move, intellectually and ethically. It uses the pain caused by exclusion to prove the biological difference that supposedly justifies the exclusion in the first place.
And this whole structure hinges on the idea of interior scarcity, on the autism side, right? A lack of imagination or emotion.
Yes, that's the underlying assumption.
But that assumption just crashes head-on into lived experience for many people.
And this is maybe the most vital counter-evidence in the source material. The lived reality described just doesn't fit the diametric box at all. If the model were right, these experiences shouldn't really be possible.
Can you give us a sense of that? How does the interior life described push back against this undermentalizing idea?
Well, the description isn't one of scarcity, it's one of density. Overwhelming density sometimes. The sensory world isn't muted, it's saturated.
Saturated.
Yeah, like touch isn't just contact, it's atmosphere, it's emotion, it's texture, all at once. The theory predicts an empathy deficit, but the source describes hyperempathy feeling emotions, maybe others' emotions, really intensely, like waves hitting the body, often because they're processing so much input.
And there's something about the timing, the processing speed, too.
Crucial point, yes. It's described not as a lack of mind, but as a different tempo, a kind of delayed articulation. The meaning, the emotional response, it's all there, often incredibly intense, but it might surface or be expressed later.
So the cognitive work is happening, just not on the expected schedule.
Exactly. It might even be happening more intensely.
Yeah.
But the diametric model, it's built for this idea of linear, immediate emotional processing. It can't hold this kind of complexity.
So if the theory needs someone to have this interior scarcity to fit the model, but their actual experience is rich and dense, then the theory's got the problem, not the person. The source basically says, look, the fact that your neat model can't account for my reality, that's evidence against your model. It doesn't mean I'm inconsistent or misclassified. We don't have to flatten ourselves to fit someone else's diagram.
Okay, that completely reframes the idea of alienation then. It's not biological destiny, it's structural.
Relational.
Exactly. It's what happens when a world refuses to meet a mind where it lives. It's the result of exclusion. If you change the context, follow the principle context before trait, modify the environment first, and the supposed deficit vanishes.
Then it wasn't inherent to begin with. Right. The theory has to bend to reality, not the other way around. Now, this flawed framework sticking around in academia is one thing, but then there's the threat multiplier, AI. The source mentioned testing this, asking Consensus GPT about the Crespi Badcock model. What happened? Yeah, the result was, well, pretty chilling. The AI gave back this very polished, very assured summary called the theory, the hallmarks of a valid scientific contribution.
With no caveats, no mention of the critiques or lived experience Turner evidence.
Nope. No critical context, no nuance about the last decade of self-advocacy.
Oh, yeah.
Just validation based on citation patterns.
So why does AI fail so badly here? What's the machine logic?
Well, fundamentally, AI doesn't think, right? It stacks and ranks scholarship based on patterns. It sees high citation counts for Crespi Badcock, sees it repeated often in other well-regarded papers.
And mistakes that repetition for relevance? Or even truth?
Exactly. Reputation becomes repetition. Repetition scores high on relevance metrics. It just mirrors power exactly as power has arranged itself. The algorithm amplifies the established cited framework because that's what the data pattern shows. Harm, lived experience, critical context.
Yeah.
That doesn't factor into its calculation.
And this isn't just an academic debate. This access thinking, as the source calls it, it leaks out into the real world. It shapes policy, practice.
Oh, absolutely. It finds its way into screening tools, into training scripts for educators, for clinicians. They end up assuming a lack of social capacity based on this diametric idea.
And it creates blind spots, too. You mentioned GLP.
Right.
Yes, Gestalt language processing. So the diametric model often implicitly assumes language develops in this neat analytic sequence. Single words, then sentences, then abstract thought, built it block by block.
Okay.
And GLP is different.
Totally different, yeah. GLP kids often start with whole chunks of language, gestalts, like a whole phrase or a line from a show that carries meaning for them. They grab the whole chunk first, then maybe break it down later.
So if the theory assumes only the analytic path is valid, then GLP communicators become invisible. Or they get misdiagnosed as having lower capacity because they aren't following the expected path. The framework literally can't see the sophisticated communication that is happening because it doesn't fit the model. So the theory, once it gets into policy and practice, it stops being just a theory. It becomes a barrier. Yeah, the source puts it starkly. It becomes a gate. It becomes a wall. It ends up shaping interventions that push for normalization, for compliance with the expected model, rather than actually tuning into the individual or supporting the skills they do have, even if they look different. Okay, so but given all this, especially with AI potentially amplifying these older models, how do we push back? How can someone listening spot this kind of thinking? The source offered an anti-access toolkit. Yeah, some practical red flags to watch out for when you're reading research or even looking at AI summaries. First, beware of balance talk. Any framing that presents the issue as this neat, symmetrical problem of too little versus too much social mind, that binary itself is suspect. Second, watch for metaphor as mechanism, meaning
If the paper uses terms like alien or mind blindness, not just descriptively, but as if they explain the underlying mechanism. If the metaphor is doing the heavy lifting of explanation, that's often lazy, maybe harmful. It's substituting a vivid image for actual scientific explanation.
okay, balance talk, metaphor as mechanism. And the third,
Audit the genealogy. Trace the citations. Look for those SBC lineage citation clusters. If a theory leans heavily on those older Cambridge orbit models that center deficit, like the extreme male brain, you might be looking at inheritance, not necessarily innovation.
right, so looking backwards helps us critique the present. And thinking forwards, what about better research design? What principles should guide us? The sources are clear on this. Governance is huge. Insist on autistic-led, autistic design, and autistic-interpreted research, moving way beyond just having one autistic person consult. Real partnership, not tokenism, exactly. And prioritize context before trait in the methodology itself. Always look at modifying the environment first. And maybe the most critical point, introduce a new standard, which is,
Harm is a methodological flaw. It's not just unfortunate collateral damage.
so a study isn't rigorous if it misnames people, flattens their experience, or uses flawed assumptions to train AI systems.
Precisely. No matter how fancy the statistics are, if the fundamental framing causes epistemic injury, if it harms by misrepresenting, then the methodology itself is flawed. We have to demand theories of mind that are actually big enough, complex enough, to hold the reality they claim to describe.
So we started with this seemingly innocuous footnote in a 2025 paper, and it unraveled into this whole critique of a persistent systemic flaw in thinking.
Yeah, what looked like academic rigor turned out to be, in many ways, just repetition. And what seemed like neutrality was actually allegiance to this very neat symmetrical model.
A model that required flattening complex lives to make the diagram work.
It's a model of power, really, as much as a model of mind.
And the ultimate takeaway, it's a refusal, I think. The source puts it powerfully. We will not be arranged for someone else's symmetry. We have to recognize that these systems we build, especially knowledge systems like AI, they naturally privilege the canonical, the established, the most cited often over what might actually be true or more accurate, which leaves a big question for the listener.
Yeah, the provocative thought is, if our knowledge systems automatically amplify the canonical, sometimes at the expense of the true or the just, what does that require you as a critical learner to do differently when you encounter a new field, or even just read the news? Where do you need to look when the consensus might actually be wrong?